Hi, first of all, thank you both for giving your talks and for your Mudang experience. And I appreciate you holding everybody's feet to the fire with your respective talks. I was hoping that you could probably speak to something that I've sort of had in mind here. I've always believed that these kinds of biases start in the subconscious, and I think that changing the subconscious will begin to change our outward attitudes towards indigenous tribes. I was hoping maybe you could, both of you could speak to that to some degree.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something that I think is something that I'll speak for myself, and that I actively am trying to subvert that with my graduate students who are indigenous, who come into geography not feeling like they're good enough. And I had that experience myself. I was told, when I was applying for Ph.D. programs, I had no shortage of programs, including the one up the road in Seattle at UW, tell me, UW ghosted me actually when I told them the work that I did and that I wanted to come to their program. But other places were quite open, like, well, we don't really do indigenous geographies. And then I got into the graduate program at Ohio State and had a preeminent faculty member tell me to drop out because he's like, well, we don't do indigenous geographies here. You've got to, you'll have a really long road ahead of you trying to support yourself here. You should just drop out and maybe go to Minnesota at some point. And then I graduated ahead of his two grad students and got a tenure track position ahead of them as well. So I guess Ohio State did do indigenous geographies overall, after all. But I think one of the things is, like, people, when you deal, and with Native folks, like, we're constantly told that our cultures and our histories and our life ways are backwards and primitive, right? I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I feel like the go-to for folks like, oh, well, your ancestors worshiped the sun and ate people. And I'm like, well, no, we didn't. But also, when you grow up hearing these sorts of things, right, it becomes embedded in your psyche that, well, I'm not good enough, that, like, I can't make it here. There's no place for me, right? And so I view it as a responsibility on my end as somebody that has made it into these spaces, to let my students know that, no, it's, you are good enough, you are worthy, and that it is not that that they need to prove their worth to the university. I say the university needs to prove its worth to you. They need to justify why they deserve you in the institution, not the other way around, right? And it takes a lot of work. Like, it's these subconscious beliefs that we and limits that we put on ourselves. You don't get rid of those overnight, right? But if you tell them that, like, no, you belong here, and you support them and you advocate for them, before too long, you might be lucky enough that they start to actually believe it. And when they start to believe it, then they begin to blossom and they begin to do really, really, really good work. And so I think it's easier said than done, but kind of, reinforcing the belief that if you are in those spaces, it is because you deserve to be there, right? So this whole right-wing DEI didn't earn it. That's bullshit, right? Like, no, they did earn it, right? And so they belong there for a reason. It is no accident that they are in these structures. It is no accident that we are here, right? And so getting over that, and also, like, I speak for, like, as an Anishinaabe Ojibwe person, like, we tend to be very, like, iffy around taking up space. We tend to be kind of, like, humble when we do that, and kind of, allowing ourselves to maybe sometimes not be humble, right? Actually take up that space that we deserve and that we have earned, right? And throw our weight around a little bit. And once you kind of do it, and once you build that habit, it gets a lot easier. Trust me, I'm a lot more confident now than I was even a few years ago. I would not have been able to get up there and basically call out my department in front of a packed room like I am now, but the way I view it is, like, my ancestors didn't survive a genocide for me to stay silent when it comes to the harm that is being done to our people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that. I'm Cheyenne, Italian, and a Taurus. I'm the trifecta of stubborn. I was never going to be bullied out of a program. Lord knows they tried. I got told I was too ghetto for grad school. I got spat on my first day of my PhD program. I got told to go back to the res, and I kind of laughed because, like, at that point, I had never lived on the res. Those are some of the experiences that Indigenous students are navigating. When it comes to, like, racism or bias in the academy or in geography, I don't know that I buy that it's subconscious. Like, it's hard to believe that when you get spat on or your colleague gets dragged by his braid, you know? But I think also, if you've made it this far to get a doctorate or you're a faculty member somewhere, you've demonstrated research skills of some kind. You've demonstrated intelligence at a certain level, theoretically. And you've demonstrated the ability to learn new things. And so I think if you choose to participate in this space as a geographer or as an academic, a scholar, whatever you want to call it, you have to be willing to learn new things. That's part of what being a scholar is. And you have to be willing to address, you have to be willing to make the subconscious conscious. That's part of being a good scholar. I think if you're not willing to do that, you're a pretty lazy scholar, which Lord knows the academy's full of those. But I guess that's my 2 cents on that question.
It's less of a question, I guess, and more of a thank you to emphasize that, especially because you said you changed your talk because of what you observed, and I know that's extra labor, and it certainly is additional emotional labor. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate it, and I know a lot of other people really appreciate it, and we're definitely going to take what you both said and work on it and move the conference and society forward in all the ways that we can. And I'll definitely be reaching out. I'm very interested in hearing more. And so it's more of a comment than a question, but I want to say thank you both.
And just since we're in the interest of time, is there anything? 12:20. Oh, we have till 12:20. Oh, heck yeah! I've just gained like 10 HP there.
Thank you for your talk, both of you. Dr. Lucchesi, you said that the technology that you use doesn't make the result any less indigenous, but you still mention a lot about tools later, and we need to think about tools. So, like the software that you use, it can make you more dependent, it can force categories on you, and so on. It can be problematic. So I don't know if you have any insights or can suggest any sources for thinking about technology, software, and so on.
Yeah, so this is actually a project I'm working on right now with that First Nation where we're trying to repair harm. That was one of those cases where they approached me and said that they wanted to work with myself in my lab on a number of different projects. And one of them that we're trying to do is actually help them develop a mapping software that's open source and housed and developed by community members in order for them to map out their own territories, particularly for their Guardians program, which is trying to really map out the full extent of ecologically sensitive areas there in the Clayoquot Sound region of BC, which is a UNESCO biosphere reserve, but is also rich with biodiversity. One of the really tough things that they had run into is that there's obviously people, a lot of indigenous communities are quite wary around Esri and the ARC suites. It's kind of ironic because one of my lab members works for Esri, which is funny, but I think he's kind of like trying to take the subversive route where he's like, how can we try to like push Esri to be less dependent on the military industrial complex and things. But that community said, well, we haven't found a mapping software that isn't proprietary. And what I mean by that is I actually reviewed a mapping software called Terra Stories fairly recently, and that was one where it was supposed to ostensibly give communities the tools to map out their own stories and map out their own histories and be able to like privately store them. But the problem is that, and I did some digging, I'm like, well, the people that own the nonprofit that created this, it's an all-white board. There's no indigenous representation, and they still hold the keys to the software, so to say. And so one of the big things in data sovereignty is that, people say, well, we'll just give all the data back to the communities, right? But oftentimes it's done in ways that is basically illegible to them, right? And so it essentially forces a dynamic where the researcher still kind of is essential to be able to like interpret and parse out that data. And so what we're doing is we're applying for, we have like a 10-year plan to apply for probably something in the area of 20 to $50 million in grant funding, where we're going to develop I guess in an ideal world, and I'm an optimist by hope, I run a geographic futures lab for God's sakes, is that we'd be able to, host data servers in the community and have them be able to develop and maintain that software and teach community members how to develop the map software. And then at the end of the day, and I don't know how I'm going to word this to the tri-agencies yet, because they don't really like hearing this, is like, at the end of the day, we're going to hand it all over to the community and say, we have no part in this, because that's not our stories to hold on to. That's not our data to hold on to. And so I think in a world where open source software and open source mapping is increasingly becoming more important and more desirable, right, as somebody that's on the QGIS train myself, when I do dabble in like GIS mapping, I think, helping Indigenous nations to develop the capacity to really have full control of those mapping tools is going to be really vital, right? Because it'll allow them to be able to do the work, but it'll also allow them to be able to do so, I dare say, without us in academia having to hold their hands through it.
I'm going to say some prayers that project comes to fruition, because that sounds amazing. I agree. I think every tool has its pros and cons, and the more important thing is making sure the community has a sustainable pipeline of people that are competent to use those tools and decide which ones are appropriate for which projects and which ways. It's funny, like ArcGIS does have a hold on a lot, but one thing I do appreciate is that through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they make it freely accessible to tribes, so that at least we're not paying for it. I can say, working at my tribe's TIPO office, there's definitely multiple departments in our tribe that use ARC, and kind of are taught that like that's the program to use and aren't really aware of alternatives. And of course there are alternatives. And so it's been kind of like a path for me in that role to explain what those alternatives are, and how they can be used. At TIPO, we actually do use Terra Stories, and it has a lot of benefits. As Dr. Smiles mentioned, it's not perfect, but it has been good for us in mapping cultural stories that we don't want to share out with the public. And we also use its partner software, Mapeo, which we have field techs that go out and document cultural sites, and we're training the field techs to use Mapeo. So there are cool resources out there, but at the end of the day, my preference, as I mentioned, is hand-drawn maps. I will like die on the hill protecting Adobe Illustrator, because it's like, I think people perceive it as less scientific, but once you're willing to accept that every map is objective, I think Illustrator is the way to go, because it gives you so much more freedom than any other platform. And Terra Stories and Mapeo tries really hard. It's available in Indigenous languages. You can design your own icons. And so there is a lot more flexibility. But Illustrator is what I recommend, not just in terms of aesthetic, but also security. Our maps aren't necessarily stored on any platform that would be accessible like on a cloud, because it's private. And doing hand-drawn work gives you that flexibility and that freedom and that like high-level data security of like, I know it's on these 3 hard drives and nowhere else. And these hard drives are never connected to the internet, and they live with trusted people, and that's the way it is. That's how we operate.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on that. I'm working on a similar kind of, bespoke GIS project with an Indigenous organisation in the Bay Area. We've already set up a data server that's sort of separate, and we're sort of moving into a data phase. And I'm just wondering, because one of the issues that we keep coming across, they don't want to use Esri. They've sort of outlined that elements of reprojection and partiality in seeing are really important. And we're sort of thinking through questions around data sovereignty. And I'm like, look, this is all your guys, you'll get it all at the end, that's fine. But one of the issues is that so many of the software systems, even the open source software systems, are still based upon these kind of enlightenment values where you've still got someone at the top who is all-seeing and all-knowing. But the knowledge they have doesn't really work like that. It's like fundamentally partial, so that different, for instance, they want to find somewhere to house recordings of elders' stories, for instance, but I shouldn't have access to that as a developer, and nor should anyone else who's not actually able to hear those stories. I'm just wondering, like, have you thought through this kind of problem, that the way in which, not just like the idea of open data, but also how do you close it down when those systems are designed on organizational models, not cultural models?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would recommend doing some, doing some reading on some of the work that's been going on in Aotearoa with Maori health data, because there's a lot of literature out there on their health framework. So health data in Aotearoa, for folks who are not familiar, there is a very strong, very developed data framework system where people can input health data, and Maori health authorities have been participating in this, but have had that concern of like, well, we don't want other researchers or other, other officials to have access to this. And so I know that actually there's been a lot of work out of data sovereignty out of Aotearoa that's been really good, but they've have talked about the ways where they've been able to essentially lock out parts of that data framework. How that would work in this sort of situation, it would really kind of depend on the kind of the community's needs and the infrastructure that you're working within. But it would be, one of the things that, when we've run into similar problems is we essentially try to go with the community as far as we can go and build up their capacity, and then essentially remove ourselves, right? Would be one way of doing so. But I don't know if there's a clean answer to that, because again, this is, in an open source world, right? And this idea of open data, it can be antithetical to the idea of Indigenous data sovereignty, because it'll be like, well, you can't work with open source systems and then expect to like close it off and make it proprietary in that sort of way. But they're thinking about it from like a Western capitalist model, where it's like, well, if you create it, you own it, right? No, not more of like, well, maybe there's things that are like not for us to know. So I don't know. You might have a better idea than I do.
There are some systems that are trying to grapple with these questions. Like Mukuru is one of them, Nunalit, and I think Terror Stories and Mapeo try to get to it as well, because you can have settings, like you can create teams and roles internally, and then also have external settings. So you have external settings on who can access what stories or videos or things like that. But you also have internal settings where you can decide, like if I upload a video to our Terror Stories map, I can decide who on our team has access to see it. And Mapeo is designed to access offline. It doesn't require any kind of internet connection, which gives you another layer of privacy. So there are people thinking through this stuff. But again, that's why I come back to like external hard drives that are never connected to the internet, and like, because then you have full freedom to decide who has access to what. In the absence of being able to do that, what I would recommend is, rather than looking to solve that issue in the software, solve that issue in the relationship building. And so you can, like in your contract, like your service contract with this tribe, laying out what the rules are, like there should be a dedicated section around data accessibility, data security, and privacy. And you can address some of these concerns of like, as a developer, I have back-end access, but I acknowledge and promise that I'm not going to actually review the materials you're putting in there. I'm just going to use back-end access to support it, to make sure that the software is functioning the way it needs to. And give them legal recourse if you break that agreement. Because if you're sincere about not accessing it, then it shouldn't be a worry anyways. So I think you can like write it into the relationship building in a way that actually like builds more trust and makes that relationship stronger.
We have some questions written by the DEI committee. I wanted to definitely get this one, which we asked yesterday. Often questions in panels focus on Native and Indigenous or just DEI scholarship can focus on violence and the extractive past. But in an attempt to bring joy to these conversations, can you elaborate on some projects or work you're doing or have seen that excite you and bring joy and to your respective communities?
Yeah, well, I could pick any number of the ones that we're doing in my lab right now, because my graduate students and my lab members are just an extraordinary set of human beings. I mean, they're much more optimistic than I can be sometimes. One of the things that I'm really super excited about actually is work back in my homelands, where we've been asked to begin to develop a youth geography camp for Ojibwe children, where they can. I know I'm super excited about it. I mean, this is going to be. I'm putting in a insight grant for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to help fund relationship building for this, in order to start building towards this, but something where children can learn, youth can learn about, our own spatial knowledge from elders and from knowledge holders, and they can also apply that to some of the most pressing issues that are facing our community, such as the exercise of treaty rights and environmental issues. That really excites me, because for me, even though I'm 34, but my position in academia is such that I feel like now I'm part of the establishment. Now I'm kind of getting into the older generations, and now my goal is to now turn towards the next generation of scholars, and how can I help them, and how can I open up the door for them to be able to go further than I ever could. And I think that part of that from my own cultural teachings is to bring that knowledge to the youth, and really allow the youth to share the knowledge that they have, and to bring them together with elders and knowledge holders in our community, in order to really empower them to do really transformative work. I still have a long career ahead of me, but I'm like, at some points, I will probably have nothing further to contribute, right? Or really, it would be the culturally appropriate thing for me to do at some point will be to step aside, right? And allow the next generation to do that good work. And so by helping plant the seeds now, right, I make that possible for them to be able to do that good work. I don't know.
I'm really excited about land-based healing. That's what I'm getting into, and shared a little bit of that in my presentation, but to go into a little more depth, last summer, our members of our family caught 13 wild horses. We have a couple Mustang herds on our reservation, and there were two colts, or a colt and a filly, that I picked out and were like, those are mine. And they were ironically the ones that nobody else wanted. Because one of them was just like a sweet little filly, so a girl horse that she just was so snuggly. And I asked her, blink twice if your name is Blossom. And she totally blinked twice. And so I took her and her brother. At the same time, multiple women in my family, myself included, were navigating through healing from different forms of violence. At the time, I was helping to raise my teenage nieces that had experienced violence, and they also were really into the horses, and it became kind of me and the girls, and it shouldn't be normal in our community. It's not traditional, but unfortunately, it's kind of normal now to have an all-woman household. And that's the case for my family, for me and the girls. And, I'm young, I'm 33, and I was the oldest one in the household, which is also not traditional at all, but is a result of colonization. And so us, me and the girls and these horses were trying to figure out our own healing, how to care for these animals, how to reconnect a relationship that had been taken from all of us, including the horses, because these are horses that have been in relationship to our people for a very long time. And so learning to do that in a good way, and then now, seeing Blossom pregnant, and planning for the next generation of horses. It's funny because the algorithm was I kept getting Facebook ads that was you're gonna have a baby, and I was like, I don't think I am, actually. That's not what's happening. And then I found out my horse was pregnant. Okay. So now I'm thinking more about what feminist Mustang herd management looks like in an Indigenous context, and how rekindling that relationship in specific between horses and women in our community, especially, almost all the women in our community are survivors of violence, and what that looks like. That's where I'm at. That's my current work.
Thank you all. And lastly, if there's anything else that you wanted to share briefly that nobody asked, or if there's anything you want to plug that we all can support.
feel obligated to think of something.
No, this is completely optional. You can say
I'm such a
goodbye.
talker that like, oh, I have a moment to talk about anything.
Go off.
I mean, I realized that, you know, I gave you guys the mood dang experience today. Very cute, very mad. But I appreciate you for being patient and into it. But I do want to communicate that, like, I do think that there is immense value in collaboration, and that, you know, like, don't be afraid of angry natives. Because, like, I think it's also, you know, it was Cheyenne, a woman who killed Custer with his own sword, cut him in half, and then wore it as a trophy till she died in jail. That's who our women are. So, like, even if I'm happy, you're going to get that experience from me. And there's a lot of harm to fix, and so there's anger there and hurt feelings. But I'm taking more than my establishment. I'm sorry. But there's a story that I just want to close with, and it's from my experience as an advocate. We had a young white woman reach out to our organization who felt really moved by what she learned about missing and murdered Native people. And she had young children and was thinking, like, I can't fathom as a mom losing my kid to this kind of violence. And she really wanted to, like, get involved and do something. And she asked me, what can I do? And I was like, I don't know. Because I was triaging so much and was like, we get a lot of well-meaning people that, like, I just don't have time for. And so, you know, I tried to give her some resources and tools to learn from and didn't expect to ever hear from her again. And then, like, 2 months later, she reaches out to me. She's like, Annita, I have to tell you. I'm like, all right, here we go. And she got the biggest newspaper in the state to apologize for their lack of coverage on the issue, and make dedicated coverage for every case as it comes up. And I was like, how did you do this? And she was like, I just called them until they hated me. Yeah, she literally kept calling all the newspapers in the state every time someone went missing and was like, why aren't you covering this? Why aren't you covering this? To the point where they were like, lady, you're harassing us. And she was like, I'm a stay-at-home mom. I can watch Frozen 5 times today, or I can call you 5 times today. And she did it. Like, it was immensely helpful. It leveraged the resources and ability that she had. And it really made a difference in our community around that issue. So be the persistent, stubborn woman calling all the newspaper companies or what, you know, like, there's a million ways to collaborate, and there's definitely room for non-Native people to be at that table in a really helpful way.
Yeah, I'll just kind of piggyback off of that. Is there's one of the biggest stumbling blocks I find when people do work in Native communities and they're dealing with kind of this legacy of harm is that they encounter people that are angry and people that might be sharing their trauma and sharing the harm. And more often than not, and I run into this in academia myself, is like the angry Indian trope, where it's like, oh yeah, they're mad at us, and like, you know, well, that makes me feel super uncomfortable. And American and Canadian settlers do not like feeling uncomfortable. Like, it is like one of the worst feelings in the world for them, and it really leads them to like really draw back or be violent in like really harmful ways. And I always try to I try to soothe their fears by saying, like, if they are talking, and I've worked in a number of Native communities now, and one of the constants I have found is if they are talking to you, that is a really, really good thing, because I have seen when a Native community will just completely turn their backs and not talk to somebody. As a matter of fact, in my own culture, when we are turning our back on somebody is like one of the most offensive things you can do, where it's essentially saying, you have nothing of value to tell me and I don't want to listen to you anymore. And if they're doing that figuratively or literally, I'm like, that is when you know you fucked up, right? That is when you are rude, you have wrecked things. But as long as they are talking to you, even if it feels uncomfy, embrace it and fight through that discomfort.
Thank you both so very much.